Marcus Johnson pressed his back against the brick wall of Miller's convenience store, his heart pounding against his ribs. The evening air carried the scent of rain and cigarette smoke as he watched the scene unfold in the parking lot. He'd only stepped out to grab some printer paper for his history assignment. Instead, he'd walked into something that made his blood run cold. The silver Mercedes gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its engine purring quietly. Marcus could see every detail through the gaps between the stacked cases of soda by the store's side entrance. Two men stood by the car's trunk, their movements casual but their eyes constantly scanning the area. The taller one had a cobra tattoo snaking up his neck, while the shorter man wore an expensive watch that caught the light when he moved. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened his notes app, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. Time: 7:42 p.m. Location: northeast corner of Miller's lot. Vehicle: Mercedes-Benz S-Class. Silver, tinted windows, license plate partially visible. Begins with XRK. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Details matter, son. They're the difference between a lead and a dead end. The sound of teenage laughter made his head snap up. Two girls from his school, probably freshmen, were walking toward the store's entrance, completely oblivious to the scene unfolding mere feet away. Marcus watched in horror as they approached, their heads bent over a phone screen. The men by the Mercedes tensed, and the shorter one's jacket shifted, revealing something tucked into his waistband. Without thinking, Marcus let his phone clatter to the ground. The noise drew everyone's attention. The girls looked up, startled, while the men turned sharply toward the sound. In that moment of distraction, the girls hurried into the store, disappearing behind the beer posters plastered on the windows. Marcus held his breath, pressing himself flatter against the wall. The men exchanged looks, closed the trunk, and slid into the Mercedes. As they pulled away, Marcus forced himself to focus. Right taillight slightly dimmer than the left, small dent on the rear bumper, custom chrome rims. Every detail could matter. Once the car disappeared around the corner, Marcus retrieved his phone with trembling hands and added more notes. His father, Dr. James Johnson, had spent 15 years working with the police department. He'd raised Marcus to believe in justice, in doing the right thing even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Inside the store, the two girls were buying slushies, giggling about something on their phones. They had no idea how close they'd come to potential danger. Marcus bought his printer paper and waited until they left before heading out himself, taking a different route home than usual, constantly checking over his shoulder. At home, he transferred his notes to paper, drawing a diagram of the parking lot and marking positions. He added descriptions of the men: heights, builds, clothing, distinguishing features. The cobra tattoo was drawn in careful detail. He'd inherited his mother's artistic talent, and now it could help catch criminals instead of just filling his sketchbooks. Marcus knew what some people would say. A black teenager walking into a police station with a story about drug dealers. He could already imagine the dismissive looks, the assumptions, but his father had built a career breaking down those barriers, earning respect through dedication and expertise. Marcus straightened his shoulders, tucked the report into a folder, and checked the time. The precinct would still be open for another hour. He had a duty to report what he'd seen. Those girls could have walked into something terrible. Next time, someone else might not be so lucky. With renewed determination, Marcus grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, the report secure in his hand, unaware that he was about to face exactly the kind of prejudice his father had spent years fighting to eliminate. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Marcus approached the front desk, his report clutched firmly in hand. Officer Jenny Martinez looked up from her computer, offering a warm smile that eased some of his tension. She'd known his father for years, but tonight she was off duty, gathering her belongings to head home. "Captain Sullivan's in his office," she said, pointing down the hallway. "He's the commanding officer tonight." She hesitated, something flickering in her eyes. Do you want me to walk you in? Marcus shook his head. I got this. Thanks, Officer Martinez. He squared his shoulders and walked down the corridor, his shoes squeaking against the freshly waxed floor. The walls were lined with commendations and community service awards, including several featuring his father's signature at the bottom. The door to Captain Sullivan's office stood ajar, warm lamplight spilling into the hallway. Marcus knocked twice, his knuckles rapping against the wooden frame. Inside, Captain Sullivan sat hunched over his desk, his salt and pepper hair illuminated by his desk lamp. He didn't look up. Come in, Sullivan muttered, his eyes fixed on his computer screen. His fingers continued typing as Marcus entered, the keys clicking loudly in the quiet office. The captain's desk was cluttered with manila folders and half-empty coffee cups, a stark contrast to the pristine walls covered in departmental certificates. Marcus cleared his throat. Sir, I need to report a crime I witnessed. Sullivan's typing slowed but didn't stop. His eyes flicked up for a fraction of a second, then returned to his screen. The reporting desk is closed. Come back tomorrow. But Officer Martinez said. Marcus started, then steadied himself. Sir, I witnessed what I believe was a drug deal. There were 2 suspects, and I have detailed descriptions of both them and their vehicle. 2 teenage girls almost walked into the middle of it. Sullivan finally stopped typing. He leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of annoyance and dismissal. And you're what, 15? 16, sir. I have everything documented here. Marcus stepped forward, extending the folder. The vehicle was a silver Mercedes S-Class with a partial plate number. One suspect had a distinctive cobra tattoo on his neck and... Look, kid, Sullivan cut him off, waving his hand. Do you know how many suspicious vehicle reports we get from teenagers? Next you'll tell me they were carrying duffel bags full of cash. Marcus felt heat rising in his neck. No, sir. But I saw one of them had a weapon tucked in his waistband when the girls approached. A weapon? Sullivan's eyebrows rose. That's a serious accusation. You sure you're not letting your imagination run wild? Maybe they were just meeting friends. Did you consider that? The implication in Sullivan's tone was clear. Marcus gripped the folder tighter, his nails digging into the cardboard. I know what I saw, sir. My father always taught me to. Your father should teach you about wasting police resources, Sullivan interrupted, turning back to his computer. We've got real crimes to solve. Put your report in the box outside if you want, but I'm telling you now, this isn't going anywhere. Marcus stood there for a moment, the folder trembling slightly in his hands. Through the office window, he could see Officer Martinez lingering by the front desk, concern etched on her face. She'd stayed past her shift, watching, waiting. Without another word, Marcus placed the folder on Sullivan's desk. The captain didn't even glance at it, just swept it into his drawer with other papers. As Marcus turned to leave, he caught his reflection in the office window, his father's son, straight-backed and dignified, even as his eyes burned with unshed tears of frustration and anger. Officer Martinez was gone when he reached the front desk. Outside, the night air felt thick and heavy, matching the weight in his chest. As he walked home, Marcus pulled out his phone and opened his contacts, his thumb hovering over his father's name. No, he decided. Not yet. First, he needed to process what had just happened, to understand why wearing his father's values like armor hadn't been enough to shield him from prejudice. 3 blocks from where his son had just experienced bitter disappointment, Dr. James Johnson stood before a room of 20 detectives in the department's training center. The projection behind him displayed statistics on officer-involved incidents, but his attention was focused on the engaged faces before him. De-escalation isn't just about the words you choose, he explained, pacing slowly across the front of the room. It's about recognizing your own triggers, your own biases, and how they affect your split-second decisions. His voice carried the weight of experience, each word carefully chosen from 15 years of working alongside law enforcement. Detective Sarah Chen raised her hand. Dr. Johnson, What about situations where we don't have time to analyze our biases? When decisions need to be immediate? James smiled, recognizing the challenge in her question. It was why he'd recommended her for promotion last year. She never accepted easy answers. That's exactly why we train now, detective. Every interaction, every choice you make in calmer moments, shapes your instincts for those critical situations. The room fell silent as James clicked to the next slide, showing a graph of successful interventions since implementing his training program. The numbers spoke for themselves. Complaints down 60%, successful de-escalations up 45%, officer injury rates cut in half. Your instincts are like muscle memory, he continued, thinking of the countless conversations he'd had with Marcus about these same principles. We're not just building skills here, we're rebuilding reflexes. At the back of the room, Chief Rodriguez nodded approvingly. She'd been one of the first to support James's programs, even when other precincts dismissed them as too soft, too theoretical. Now they were requesting his training methods across the state. James checked his phone during a brief break. No messages from Marcus, which was unusual for this time of evening. He pushed away a slight worry. His son was responsible, probably just focused on homework. Dr. Johnson, Chief Rodriguez called him over, her expression serious. I've been meaning to ask, would you consider expanding your role here? We're creating a new position, Deputy Chief of Community Relations. Your work has been instrumental in rebuilding trust between our officers and the community. James felt a familiar tension in his shoulders. It was the same offer, in different forms, that he'd received over the years. A chance to move from consultant to full-time staff, to have a bigger impact. But he'd always maintained his independence, believing he could do more good as an outside voice. I appreciate the offer, Chief, he replied, watching the detectives return to their seats. But I think I'm most effective in my current role. It allows me to speak hard truths without the constraints of internal politics. Rodriguez nodded, understanding but disappointed. The door remains open, James. You've earned the respect of every officer in this building. Your influence here goes deeper than you might realize. As James returned to the front of the room, he thought about his son again. Marcus had grown up watching him navigate this world, learning to bridge gaps between communities and law enforcement. He'd inherited James's belief in the system's potential for change, his dedication to doing what was right rather than what was easy. Let's talk about real-world application, James addressed the room, unaware that at that very moment, his son was walking home alone, his faith in the system shaken by prejudice. Tell me about a situation where your first instinct proved wrong, and what you learned from it. The cruel irony that his own son was experiencing exactly the kind of bias he was teaching officers to overcome would soon shatter the careful balance he'd built between his professional and personal worlds. Detective Sarah Chen sat in the dimly lit surveillance room, mechanically fast-forwarding through footage from Miller's convenience store. 3 hours into her shift, she'd been reviewing tapes connected to a series of neighborhood drug deals. So far, nothing substantial. Until the timestamp hit 7:42 p.m. She leaned forward, finger hovering over the pause button. A silver Mercedes S-Class pulled into frame, positioning itself precisely where her informants had suggested the dealers preferred to operate. Chen's pulse quickened as she noted the partial plate. XRK. The vehicle matched a description from another case, but they'd never had enough detail to pursue it. 2 men emerged from the car. The camera angle caught the cobra tattoo on the taller man's neck in perfect detail. Chen grabbed her notebook, scribbling frantically. The shorter man's expensive watch glinted under the fluorescent lights. A Patek Philippe, probably worth more than her annual salary. These weren't street-level dealers. Movement at the edge of the frame caught her attention. A teenage boy pressed against the wall, phone in hand. Chen's heart sank as she watched him deliberately drop his phone, creating a distraction that diverted the dealer's attention from 2 approaching girls. The boy's quick thinking had potentially prevented a tragedy. Roll back the footage, she muttered to herself, isolating frames of the Mercedes. dented rear bumper, mismatched taillight brightness, custom chrome rims. Every detail matched perfectly with something. Chen frowned, trying to place why these specifics felt familiar. She minimized the video window and pulled up the day's filed reports. Nothing. Then she remembered Captain Sullivan's drawer. He had a habit of filing reports he deemed unworthy of immediate attention there. Being his lead detective had its advantages. She knew where he kept the key. 5 minutes later, Chen sat at her desk, a folder open before her. The report was meticulous, hand-drawn diagrams, detailed descriptions, timestamps. The kind of observation skills most rookie officers would envy. Her eyes fell on the signature. Marcus Johnson. Johnson, she whispered, the name triggering a cascade of connections. The teenagers from Dr. Johnson's photos on his desk. The son he frequently mentioned in training sessions. The boy who'd inherited his father's analytical mind and dedication to justice. Chen grabbed the report and footage stills, her steps echoing through the quiet station as she marched toward Sullivan's office. The captain was exactly where she expected, reviewing budget reports with his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Captain," she said, dropping the evidence on his desk without ceremony. "We need to talk about the report you dismissed earlier." Sullivan glanced up, irritated. "Detective, I'm in the middle of." "That boy you turned away." Chen pressed on, spreading out the surveillance photos. "He handed you solid gold." "The Mercedes. It's connected to the Richardson case. The watch the shorter suspect was wearing matches the description from the pharmacy robbery last month. And that cobra tattoo. We've been trying to get a clear image of it for weeks." She laid out the hand-drawn diagram next to a surveillance still. Perfect match, every detail. And those girls he mentioned. The footage shows exactly how close they came to walking into a drug deal involving known violent offenders. Sullivan's face had grown increasingly pale. "How did he?" "He's Dr. Johnson's son." Chen cut him off, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The same Dr. Johnson who's been training our department for 15 years. The one whose community outreach programs have saved countless officers' lives. The one who's speaking at the academy graduation next month about the importance of unbiased policing." The captain's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. "Dr. Johnson's." "Yes," Chen said, gathering the evidence back into the folder. "And now, sir, you need to decide how we're going to fix this. Because when Dr. Johnson finds out how his son was treated in this station, all the progress we've made, all the trust we've built, it won't mean anything." The monthly department heads meeting started like any other. 20 officers and administrators sat around the conference room's oval table, steam rising from coffee cups as they discussed budget allocations and community initiatives. Dr. James Johnson sat quietly, reviewing his notes for his upcoming presentation on department morale improvements. Captain Sullivan shifted uncomfortably 2 seats away, his usual confident posture notably absent. Detective Chen sat at the far end, her face unreadable as Chief Rodriguez called the meeting to order. "Before we begin," Rodriguez announced, "Dr. Johnson has requested a few minutes to address a personal matter that affects our department." The room fell silent. In 15 years, James had never mixed personal business with professional matters. He stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket, a habit from his clinical practice days when delivering difficult news. "Yesterday evening," James began, his voice steady but carrying an unfamiliar edge, "my son Marcus witnessed a drug transaction outside Miller's convenience store. He observed 2 suspects, documented their descriptions, their vehicle, and nearly prevented 2 teenage girls from walking into a potentially dangerous situation." Sullivan's coffee cup clinked against its saucer. Several heads turned toward him, then quickly away. "Marcus did everything we ask of our citizens," James continued. "He paid attention. He took detailed notes. He came forward, despite knowing the risks and challenges that a young black teenager might face walking into a police station alone." James placed his son's report on the table. Detective Chen had returned it to him an hour earlier, along with the surveillance footage stills. He created this report with the same attention to detail that I've tried to instill in our officers during training sessions, the same commitment to justice that I've preached in this very room. His fingers traced the folder's edge. Captain Sullivan didn't just dismiss this report. He dismissed my son's humanity. He looked at a teenager trying to do the right thing and saw only his preconceptions. Sullivan started to speak, but James held up his hand. The irony isn't lost on me, Captain. While you were disparaging my son's credibility, I was 3 blocks away, teaching your detectives about unconscious bias and community trust. The silence in the room grew heavier. Chief Rodriguez's face had hardened into a mask of controlled anger. My son didn't tell me what happened, James said, his voice growing quieter. He was too ashamed. Imagine that. My son, ashamed of trying to help his community. Detective Chen discovered the truth through security footage that validated every detail of Marcus's report. He turned to face Sullivan directly. Captain, I've spent 15 years helping this department build bridges with our community. I've defended your officers when others questioned their motives. I've believed in the possibility of change, even when history suggested otherwise. James's hands gripped the back of his chair. But last night, my son learned that sometimes those bridges only go one way. That excellence isn't always enough. That doing everything right still might not overcome someone else's prejudice. The room remained silent as James gathered his papers. Chief Rodriguez, I'll have my resignation letter on your desk this afternoon. I can't continue to teach officers about community trust while my own son. No, Sullivan interrupted, standing abruptly. His face had lost all color. Dr. Johnson, please. Your resignation would be a victory for everything you'd fought against. If anyone should resign, it's me. James paused, his briefcase half closed. This isn't about resignations, Captain. It's about whether we truly believe in the changes we claim to want. My son's report identified suspects connected to 3 open cases, but more importantly, it identified something broken in our system. The question is, are we ready to fix it? Captain Sullivan's police cruiser idled outside the Johnson residence for 20 minutes before he found the courage to step out. The modest 2-story home with its manicured lawn and American flag spoke of pride, order, and dedication, everything he'd failed to see in Marcus's eyes 2 days ago. The porch light clicked on before he reached the steps. Dr. Johnson opened the door, his expression neutral but guarded. Marcus is in the dining room, finishing his homework. He has a test tomorrow. The unspoken message was clear. Make this quick, and don't disrupt my son's life any further. Sullivan followed James through a hallway lined with family photos. Marcus as a toddler in a police costume. Marcus at 12, accepting a community service award. Marcus and his father at last year's police department picnic. Each image felt like an accusation. The dining room table was covered in textbooks and notebooks, Marcus's meticulous handwriting visible on every page. The boy looked up as they entered, his pen pausing mid-sentence, his back straightened imperceptibly. The same posture Sullivan had dismissed at the station. Marcus, Sullivan began, then stopped. The practiced apology he'd rehearsed in his car felt hollow now. Instead, he pulled out the folder containing Marcus's report. Your observations led to a major break in 3 separate cases. Detective Chen has been tracking these suspects for months. Marcus's expression remained carefully neutral, another trait he clearly inherited from his father. I just wrote down what I saw, sir. No, Sullivan shook his head, placing the folder on the table. You did much more than that. You showed initiative, courage, and professional-level attention to detail. And He swallowed hard. I let my prejudices blind me to what was right in front of me. James leaned against the doorframe, watching silently as Sullivan pulled out a chair and sat across from Marcus. The captain noticed a police academy brochure partially hidden under a physics textbook. You want to be an officer? Sullivan asked softly. Marcus met his gaze for the first time. I wanted to be. Now I'm not sure there's a place for me. The words hit Sullivan like a physical blow. He thought of his own daughter, How he'd feel if someone crushed her dreams because of their prejudices. There's a place for you, Marcus. We need officers like you more than ever. Officers who see details others miss, who act to protect strangers, who maintain their dignity even when faced with, he gestured to himself, with ignorance. Why should I believe that? Marcus's voice was quiet but firm. Sullivan reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. This is an official commendation for your assistance in an ongoing investigation. Detective Chen insisted on writing it herself. But more importantly, he placed a second document on the table. This is my formal record of failure to properly investigate a citizen report, along with my request for additional bias training and community service hours. Marcus picked up the commendation, his hand steady. You're admitting your mistake officially. Yes, Sullivan nodded. Because change doesn't happen in private conversations. It happens when we're willing to be publicly accountable. From the doorway, James finally spoke. And what happens the next time a young person comes in with a report? Sullivan turned to face his colleague. That's why I'm here. Marcus, would you be willing to help us revise our civilian reporting protocols? We need someone who's experienced both sides of the system, the dedication to serve and the pain of being dismissed. For the first time that evening, Marcus's careful composure cracked slightly. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I'd need to see the current protocols first, to document the areas that need improvement. Still taking detailed notes, I see, Sullivan said. And this time, there was only respect in his voice. 3 weeks after Marcus's report, Detective Chen's task force gathered in the briefing room. The wall displayed surveillance photos alongside Marcus's hand-drawn diagrams, now accompanied by additional evidence gathered since that night. Marcus sat quietly in the back corner, at Chen's insistence, watching his observations transform into action. The silver Mercedes has been spotted at 4 other locations, Chen announced, pointing to a map dotted with red pins. Thanks to the partial plate number and distinctive features Marcus documented, we've been able to track their pattern. She nodded toward the teenager, causing several officers to turn and acknowledge him with respectful nods. Captain Sullivan stood at the back of the room, a different man than he'd been 3 weeks ago. He'd traded his desk for the streets, spending time at community meetings he previously delegated to others. Today, he wore the same proud expression he usually reserved for his veteran officers. We moved tonight, Chen continued, distributing operation briefings. The suspects are expecting a major shipment. They don't know we've identified their warehouse thanks to the taillight description in the initial report. Marcus's hand rose tentatively. Chen smiled. Yes. The girls, he said, his voice stronger than it had been that first night at the station. The ones who almost walked into the deal. Have we warned the school about staying clear of that area? Sullivan stepped forward. Actually, Marcus, that's become part of our new community awareness program. Your father's helping us develop presentations for local schools about situational awareness and safe reporting procedures. The briefing continued, but Marcus's attention drifted to the changes he'd witnessed over the past weeks. The front desk now had a dedicated civilian reporting station, staffed by officers trained in community relations. His father's bias training had been expanded to include real-world scenarios based on Marcus's experience. And most surprisingly, Captain Sullivan had become one of the strongest advocates for the changes. After the briefing, Chen approached Marcus with a tablet. Remember those notes you took about improving our reporting protocols? Look at this. She pulled up the department's new civilian reporting app, designed with input from Marcus and other community members. Your suggestion about anonymous photo submission. It's already led to 3 solid leads. Sullivan joined them, holding a fresh folder. Marcus, got a minute? They moved to his office, the same one where Marcus had faced rejection weeks ago. The space had changed, now featuring community artwork and a prominently displayed mission statement about equal treatment under the law. The warehouse raid isn't the only operation happening tonight, Sullivan said, opening the folder. We're launching our Youth Advisory Council, and we need a founding member who understands both sides of the badge. Marcus studied the proposal. Weekly meetings with command staff, input on community relations, mentorship opportunities with detectives. His eyes caught on a familiar signature at the bottom. Detective Chen would be the program coordinator. "You've shown us our blind spots," Sullivan continued. "Not just about the drug case, but about how we treat the community we serve. We need that perspective, officially." Before Marcus could respond, a commotion erupted outside. Dr. Johnson appeared in the doorway, grinning. They got them. Chen's team just took down the whole operation. 7 arrests, including both suspects from the convenience store. Sullivan extended his hand to Marcus. "So, what do you say? Ready to help us build something better?" Marcus looked at his father, who nodded almost imperceptibly, then back at Sullivan. The captain's outstretched hand represented more than just a position. It was an acknowledgement of change, a bridge between communities, a chance to transform a moment of prejudice into lasting progress. Marcus stood and shook Sullivan's hand firmly. "When do we start?" 6 months later, the department's community room buzzed with energy. Local news cameras lined the back wall, capturing what the press release had called a new era in community policing. Marcus stood at the podium, his police academy application visible in his jacket pocket, facing a crowd that included both officers and civilians. "When I walked into this station 6 months ago," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I thought I was just reporting a crime. I didn't know I was about to become part of something much bigger." His eyes found Captain Sullivan in the crowd, seated beside Dr. Johnson, both men beaming with unmistakable pride. Detective Chen sat in the front row, her case folder open on her lap. The successful drug bust had led to 37 arrests across 3 states, dismantling one of the largest distribution networks in the region. But today wasn't about that victory. It was about the changes that had grown from one difficult night. The Youth Advisory Council started with 5 members. Marcus continued, gesturing to the teenagers seated on stage behind him. "Today, we have 23 representatives from every high school in the district. Together, we've created a reporting system that's processed over 200 legitimate tips, leading to 42 arrests, and more importantly, preventing 12 potentially violent confrontations." He held up his phone, displaying the app he'd helped design. "But this isn't just about catching criminals. It's about building trust. Every person who uses this system gets updates on their report status. Every tip is reviewed by trained officers who understand that courage comes in all ages and colors." In the audience, Marcus spotted the 2 girls from the convenience store, now youth council members themselves. They'd approached him after learning how close they'd come to danger that night, eager to help other teens stay safe. "Captain Sullivan taught me something unexpected," Marcus said, drawing surprised murmurs from those who knew the full story. "He showed me that real change isn't just about admitting mistakes. It's about transforming them into opportunities for growth." Sullivan ducked his head slightly, but his eyes remained proud. Since that night, he'd become the department's strongest advocate for community engagement, personally reviewing every civilian report that came through the system. "My father," Marcus turned to Dr. Johnson, "has always taught me that justice isn't just about enforcement. It's about understanding. Today, our department doesn't just solve crimes. We prevent them through partnership with our community." He pulled out his academy application. "Next fall, I'll be entering the police academy. Not despite what happened 6 months ago, but because of it. Because I've seen how one person's willingness to admit their prejudice and work to change it can transform an entire system." The room burst into applause as Marcus held up a thick binder. "This is our new civilian reporting protocol, created with input from officers, community members, and yes, teenagers who were brave enough to come forward. Every precinct in the state has requested copies. Change, it turns out, is contagious." As Marcus concluded his speech, Dr. Johnson and Captain Sullivan approached the podium together, a symbol of the bridge that had been built. Sullivan handed Marcus his official acceptance letter to the academy, while Dr. Johnson pinned the Youth Advisory Council's new badge to his son's lapel. 6 months ago, Marcus said quietly, just to the two men beside him, I thought I was standing against the system. Today, I realize I was helping to rebuild it. Sometimes the most important evidence isn't what we see happening on the streets. It's what we discover about ourselves in the process of doing what's right. Detective Chen joined them, carrying a fresh case file. Ready for your first official consultation, Advisor Johnson. Marcus took the file. His father's dedication and Sullivan's hard-earned wisdom now merged with his own sense of purpose. The path ahead was clear, not just for him, but for a department that had learned that its greatest strength lay in facing its weaknesses honestly and working to overcome them. One report, one person, one change at a time.